Hello, this is Greg Scorzo from Culture on the Offensive, and what we're going to be doing today is we have the privilege of interviewing a therapist, which is something very exciting that we've been wanting to do for some time. His name is Jim Williams. He practices, if I'm correct, in Birmingham, right?
It's in the South Staffordshire. It's not far from Birmingham. It's not actually Birmingham, but it's in that neck of the woods. Yeah, close enough.
And the reason we are doing this particular interview with this particular therapist is he's got some very interesting views, which are unusual for therapists. And we thought that this would be a good opportunity to maybe interrogate what therapy is to some extent by talking to somebody who has views that at least I don't normally associate with the views of a therapist. And he's also quite interesting in a lot of other ways, as you'll see. So before we begin, I just want to start by asking you, how would you describe the work that you do? What kind of a therapist are you?
I'd call myself an eclectic therapist. If you do a kind of Boolean Google search, therapists are eclectic, you'll get thousands of results, and it's usually preceded by most or many or good. And I like to push that because people don't often identify themselves as that, because you'll tend to find that therapists, psychotherapists, counsellors, whatever name they give, tend to follow a certain school or approach to therapy, even though in practice they're, pluralistic, flexible, hopefully eclectic or integrative. So I would sum up my approach as eclectic in that I trained as a psychiatric nurse. I'm accredited in interpersonal psychotherapy. I draw on a range of traditions, but I don't attach myself to any particular approach, and I'm quite happy to describe myself as eclectic and to promote that as actually a more effective label than some of the other terms that can get, you get a kind of forest of descriptions and things that can be confusing. But eclectic, that suits me.
Okay, so if I were one of your patients, what sort of things, I know this is a bit generic, but what sort of things are the appropriate range of things that I would go to ask you for help with? And is there a range of things that you wouldn't cover in your practice?
Okay, well, to give a bit of a background, the kind of service I work for, which is a psychological therapy service, which is it's funded by the primary care trust. It's not an NHS service, but it is modelled on their IAPT, that is improving access to psychological therapy services. So they tend to have quite strict, relatively strict boundaries. So there'll be people who, generally speaking, you'll encounter cognitive behavioural therapy, which a lot of people will have heard of, a person-centred counselling, and they tend to address mild to moderate depression and anxiety, but in practice it's a lot more than that. So it's a primary care service. So my training was in secondary care, as in community mental health nursing, where you'd be addressing severe mental illness and more complex presentations and mental health crises. But in practice, we work with just about anything. If someone is in crisis or high risk or complex or suicidal, then we are expected to turn to secondary care psychiatric services, because we're not equipped. The service is not designed for that. So by and large, we're talking about depression, anxiety, hypochondriasis, which the PC term is health anxiety these days, OCD, lots of familiar sort of disorders and anxiety disorders, but on paper not complex or severe or high risk. In practice, we work with people right across the board, people who've had recurrent severe mental health problems, people who've been in and out of psychiatric care for many years. So Does that answer the question, or is it a
Yeah,
bit kind
yeah.
of...
What I'm sort of curious about is it seems like there are sort of official reasons to go to a therapist. Like I have a problem quitting smoking, I have anxiety, I'm agoraphobic. But then it gets more nebulous when you start getting patients who want you to help them with, problems which seem like less like evidence of a disorder and more like them just wanting an extra person in their life to help them get through something. Like I want to help, I want you to help me with my relationship with my parents, that sort of question. Do you ever turn down people who have those sort of requests, or do you take anything and try and work with it?
Well, it's certainly the case that obviously for a whole range of reasons, somebody might come because the bottom line is they just want someone to talk to.
Yeah.
They're lonely, they're isolated, they might be struggling with, any of the things that you've talked about, and, they might not be appropriate for the service. It's quite a difficult one because, again, it depends on their symptoms and how they're presenting. So on paper, 2 or 3 or 4 or whatever people might on paper describe those difficulties, but what might distinguish one client from another is that they're quite clearly clinically depressed, that their functioning is affected significantly enough that they need some kind of professional intervention.
Mm-hmm.
It's also the case, and obviously this is a bigger, a wider question, is that there's no shortage of supply to a service like ours, and obviously that's a broader social and cultural question. How is it that there is such a huge waiting list for services like this? Why is it that so many people who are struggling with what I would call ordinary problems, and I don't mean that in a trivializing way, painful and difficult problems, and it's become de rigueur, standard routine to refer them to a psychological therapy service. So the kind of thing that someone might be struggling with, that they come to a service like ours, I would, in isolation from working with them, think that person doesn't need therapy. Again, in theory, but it doesn't mean their symptoms aren't real. You face a situation where painful bereavement or loss, or problems, family crises, or problems with struggling with their sexual identity, that they tend to be medicalized and seen as psychological problems. And people internalize that idea, so it makes sense to them that they go and see a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
And I might work with people who, in a perfect world, they don't need therapy, but it doesn't make their symptoms any less real. It's not that people are lying or they're underestimating how much they're struggling. It's more that they're living in a time and an age, in a therapeutic culture, if you like, where they're encouraged to see their difficulties as ones with which they can't be expected to cope with
Mm-hmm.
without therapeutic intervention. There is no territory that's untouchable when it comes to therapy. That's one of the benefits of therapy, is it's a confidential relationship where you can explore absolutely anything and everything. So no subject or no problem is out of bounds. But in terms of the clinical assessment, it's often quite clear that someone is functioning quite well. If their functioning is impaired significantly, that they feel that they're unable to work, or their relationships have broken down significantly, then intervention might be appropriate in a way that might not have been appropriate in the past, because they may have had more resources at their disposal in terms of personal and social, interpersonal community resources, and they really are struggling.
Mm-hmm.
But there's always that risk of indulging that, So I can think of one example where a young guy will get a lot of GP, people self-referral. There might be a GP referral, and it just said on the referral form, procrastination.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you can't imagine in the past that someone would be referred to a psychotherapist because they're procrastinating, because, that's life, isn't it, procrastinating?
Mm-hmm.
And And I saw this guy, and he said, I'm procrastinating, I can't decide what to do with my life and all the rest of it. And it was really important for me to tell him, you don't need to be here. If I agree to meet you again, because that's just reinforcing the idea that you've got a problem, which will just compound your procrastination.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need to be here. You don't have any serious psychological or emotional difficulties. And in this case, he was like, oh, that's great. I'm really pleased. I thought I had a mental health problem. You know, so it's that kind of a message is being sent to so many people that if they're struggling with something, it's probably psychological.
So procrastination seems like an easy example where we would say that's not something that should be medicalized. But there's a lot of issues where it's a bit more of a gray area. Like, what if somebody has a problem where whenever they get a job, they have a boss which always seems to pick them out of the other employees to humiliate them and treat them like crap. And this happens over and over and over again, and they're fed up with it, and they go to you to get some help, to help them sort of ask themselves, why am I moving into these kinds of employment where I have these abusive bosses? Is that something that you would tell them, you know, you don't need to be here regarding, or would you say, no, that's something you need to be in therapy about?
It depends entirely on the individual. You know, you look for those clues. So this is the thing. Something might be an ordinary, again, I use that word kind of, it might be difficult, it might be stressful. They're reacting to difficult circumstances, and it's upsetting them, upsetting the person in the way it would anyone. But there might be other circumstances where it's pressed some buttons and triggered long-term problems that have become clear to me that there's recurrent problems where they are allowing people to walk over them, or, you know, so someone might be in you know, have kind of self-defeating beliefs. In cognitive therapy, you explore the idea that a lot of the way you feel begins and ends with the way you think, and that tacitly you give permission to people to treat you badly. Again, it depends entirely on, obviously the circumstances is so unique. Again, the same people the same information might be written on the referral, but when you meet them, that assessment is so key, because then you think, right. And you bring to awareness to the client that actually what you've come here for, that you think is the problem, you've actually revealed to me that there's a long-standing problem that may go many years to childhood, and it's not really, you're reacting to this situation and you think that's the cause of your problems, but it's clear to me that it's something else. So the classic example with CBT, cognitive therapy, would that be that thing where you ask a client, you're walking down the road, you see a friend, you say hello, and they don't say hello back. Right. Everyone's had that experience. Now, some people will think, oh, never mind, they had something on their mind, forget all about it. For someone else, it will ruin their day. Now, the whole human race could be found along the pole in between, but that's a reminder that it's not what happened that made the person feel depressed. It's their relationship with themselves that confirms that, A, they definitely know they were blanked, and they might think, oh, the person doesn't like me, I don't blame them for not liking me. So someone might give you clues that this is historical, psychological problems that do need to be addressed, and the referral itself didn't tell you that much about them until you met them. Do you know what I mean? So it's kind of, lots of things are thrown your way, you know, these generic terms like work stress. But then when you meet the person, you discover things that weren't apparent to you. You had no reason to guess that they'd be there. You just look out for them, and then you think, this person could benefit from therapy.
It seems like there's a distinction. So there's the patient who could benefit from therapy, and there's the patient who you should tell, no, this isn't a therapeutic issue, this is just life. You know, we don't want to reinforce you not being able to solve problems that you should be able to solve on your own, et cetera, et cetera. The question, though, is there a principle or anything like that for differentiating between these two cases? Or is it just a judgment call?
It's a judgment call. You know, I mean, and this is the thing about, you know, you work with colleagues and supervisors and clinical leads, you might be unsure, someone might have presented in a particular way, and you think, oh, there's something missing here, or have I missed something, or am I interpreting this in a particular way? Let me, you know, discuss this with the clinical supervisor or whoever. and they'll bring in something of a perspective that maybe you haven't spotted, and yeah, it's a judgment call. So and again, it goes back to that assumption of trust that the person's being honest with you about the difficulties they're facing. But as you can imagine, it's quite a complex thing to sort of pan out and spell out the process you go through to make that assessment. So we could talk for a long time about what approaches you take to a psychological assessment. I mean, that could fill a long, an interview in itself. But it's a judgment. It's a judgment call, and with experience and practice, it usually becomes fairly clear, because obviously you're trained to spot all kinds of behavioural and other clues, and people will say all kinds of things where they're perhaps not as self-aware as they could be, and you think, will this person benefit from therapy so I can be a bit of an ally and helping them see that maybe the problems are not what they think they are, and they could benefit from psychological therapy. On the other hand, there may be people who I say, I hope you take this as a sign of encouragement, but you don't need to be here, not you're wasting my time kind of thing. Obviously, a lot of clients, often because they're self-deprecating anyway, and because of what they're feeling, I'm probably wasting your time, and of course they're not. And I'll say, I'd be wasting your time inviting you to come back again and again, because actually you're functioning quite well, and don't underestimate yourself.
Okay, what would you say to the sort of the person who thinks that the therapist is in a position really where they should have a slightly hands-off approach to the patient's personal emotional life? So, for instance, the therapist can help you quit smoking, they can help you with anxiety, they can help you stop compulsively overeating, they can help you maybe stop self-harming in certain ways if you're cutting yourself, but what they can't do is help you improve your relationship with your mother, or help you with, feeling a certain way towards your wife, because those personal issues are issues you can't make judgments about unless you know the people, and you can't completely trust the patient's objectivity in terms of how they describe those people. So really the therapist, at his or her most efficient, has to have a kind of hands-off, almost instrumental approach to helping patients with very specific problems that don't go too deeply into their lives. What would you say about that, Worry?
Well, yeah, this is the thing. There's no certainty with this. You work with an incomplete picture all the time. One person sitting in a room with someone else will present in a particular way, and you might meet a colleague years later who's worked with the same person. You realise you've been presented with a picture that wasn't accurate. But I think when people, except where they're compelled to come to therapy, when it's an expectation for legal reasons, they're saying you've got to go to therapy to meet certain standards in relation to social services, or some other question to do with access to children, etc. A whole range of things. What you see a lot of the time is someone might have been referred to a service 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times, and they never turned up. And clearly there's a pattern there. You're thinking the person wants to come, but they're afraid. Because it can be quite a difficult thing. It can be quite a courageous thing to recognise you've got serious difficulties. And when the person's finally made that decision, you can often be quite confident that you're dealing with someone who's been really honest about their circumstances, because they finally made that decision to take the plunge, as it were. And because they're concerned about not just about how they feel about how they feel about themselves, but how they treat other people. Often there's a lot of guilt and shame and anxiety. When you're in that situation, by and large, you know that you're dealing with someone who's made themselves vulnerable to you. But for them, they've taken a huge risk to be really honest about their fears and the things that they're really struggling with. And when that happens, by and large, you know you're working with something that could well be could very well be very productive. But again, yeah, it's not precise. It's not a science. This is why, in relation to the skepticism I might express towards, which I'm sure we'll touch on, therapy culture, is sometimes think therapism is to therapy what scientism is to science. It's like the unwarranted extension of that therapeutic mindset to all corners of human existence. But when it comes to actual therapeutic relationship, there's a lot of intuition there. But yeah, it's actually good. It's a good question. It's very hard to articulate when you just feel an instinct that you've made a bond or a connection with someone, and when they leave, as I always say with my colleagues, you can be fairly certain whether you think they'll come back or not. So say to a colleague, oh, they're not going to come back. They didn't want to be here. They're not ready to do this. They're not ready to face certain difficulties. Someone else might say they're going to come back because we made a connection in some way and they're ready to explore their difficulties,
Interesting. So it seems like there's something you're hinting at, which maybe I'm misinterpreting, and if I am, feel free to correct me. But it sounds like what you're saying is that one worry you have as a therapist is that at the moment there's too much therapy.
Yeah.
Would that be accurate?
Yes, it would.
Why do you think there's too much therapy?
There's too much therapy and too many therapists. I mean, perhaps I'm biting the hand that feeds me. Something I probably do. Perhaps I have something I need therapy for. Well, I think, some of the things, there are certain key phrases or keywords that people are familiar with, like mental health awareness and normalization and anti-stigma campaigns, and on the face of it, they seem very positive. But I think it's, one of the things when you're working with someone whose anxiety is such that it's really affecting their functioning, and it's something I learned myself as someone who struggled with quite severe social anxiety and agoraphobia, is don't fight anxiety. Fighting anxiety causes anxiety, just in the same way that if you try and get to sleep when you can't sleep, you won't get to sleep. Mm-hmm. It's better to accept that you can't sleep and you're more likely to sleep. And it's almost like that's kind of like become kind of universalized. So as a lot of people are aware, from a very young age now, people speak the language of mental health because they're bombarded with this assumption that the difficulties that they have in life can be seen as mental health problems. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like be careful what you wish for. So it's kind of like this preventative measure that we need to check these difficulties that children and teenagers have with anxiety, lest they develop psychiatric disorders later on in life. Which is kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think Dr. Michael Fitzpatrick, the ex-GP who wrote The Tyranny of Health, talked about the 1 in 4 mantra being like therapeutic pi, as he called it, as in the mathematical PI. Every kind of category of vulnerable people, it's kind of seen as 1 in 4 people struggle with this or suffer this or victim of this. Mm-hmm. And even though a lot of these things may start from a very well-meaning process of taking mental health seriously, and no one would want to go back to the bad old days, I think it's actually become self-defeating, because what it means is that where there is stigma with serious mental illnesses, there was, I don't know if you saw recently, there was an excellent article in The Guardian by Hannah Jane Parkinson, who writes The Guardian, journalist who struggles with serious mental health problems. She did an excellent piece recently, and she was basically saying how she's sick of what she called the mental health conversation. Mm-hmm. And she was making this point that there's a kind of, I call it a kind of a performative empathy, where people are constantly talking about mental health, but as she puts it, only about palatable mental health problems. Mm-hmm. And I would go further and say fashionable. There are certain mental health conditions that are no doubt they're fashionable, like OCD and bipolar disorder. Now, people who suffer from severe OCD, bipolar disorder, they know very well that they really, really wish it was out of fashion, because it's awful. But I would say probably about 99% of clients I meet who tell me they've got OCD most certainly have not got OCD. Lots of clients who say they're a little bit bipolar most certainly are not.
Mm-hmm.
So they've internalized this script of interpreting their difficulties as mental health problems. And it's really backfired because, of course, the people who need mental health services the most, the funding, the organisation of mental health services and integrating people into society who do struggle with severe mental illnesses, they're at the back of the queue. Mm-hmm. Because everybody else is queuing up for a mental health diagnosis. So, you know, like reading Hannah's article, it's poignant, it's full of anger, it's also very funny. You know, I really connected with that, because what you have is this mental health awareness is a kind of, it ends up being a holier than thou attitude. You know, I'm aware, you're not. And they're singing from the same hymn sheet as Theresa May, and she's grateful for this. So she's saying, oh, no, I agree. It's all about public perception, isn't it? It's about stigma and, you know, lack of awareness, which is an evasion of responsibility to organise and fund proper mental health services. In the meantime, the entire population is being diagnosed. You know, it's like everyone's on the couch. I think that's really, really bad for people's mental health, if that makes sense.
This is interesting because there's a lot of interesting issues about this idea of kind of overdiagnosing the population. Now, you could say, I mean, if I were to put my head in the mind of somebody who disagreed with this, somebody who disagreed could say, well, people have always had problems that they needed psychiatric help with, but because of the fact that there is less stigma now, everybody can feel free to get the help, whereas before they were holding it all in, and that's why it seems like everybody has, you know, suddenly gone mentally ill, whereas before it seemed like only a small handful of people were. What would you say to that objection?
Oh, you know, I can see that in one respect. Obviously, I think it's a caricature, obviously. I mean, obviously you presented it in that way. I think, you know, things have come a long way in terms of mental health treatment. And as I say, I wouldn't want to return to anything, you know. I think the problem with it is that it still goes back to that thing of eliding the distinction between ordinary suffering, and again, when I say the ordinary, I don't mean trivialise, I mean ordinary painful things, experiences, whether it be bereavement. Now, obviously, I work with bereavement counselling. These things can be, you know, they're not the opposite of depression. They can come together quite powerfully sometimes. But, you know, again, as I mentioned, Hannah Jane Parkinson is someone who's talking from the perspective of someone who really experiences severe mental health stress. We're in this situation now where we're kind of up to our ears in anti-stigma campaigns, and what they do, I think, is obscure the very real stigma for severe mental illness. So when you see a lot of attention paid to mental health, it doesn't tend to be towards the really difficult stuff. And as she points out, mental illness is not normal. And this is one of the things, it's like when people say not normal, it sounds like some kind of disparaging phrase. And this is the problem with normalisation. So, oh, it's great now, everybody's talking about mental health. Mm-hmm. But it's inconsistent and contradictory, because what you have is normal human suffering being pathologised, and yet things that are outside the norm, a severe mental illness, people are being told, yes, I understand, I feel your pain, it's just like a broken leg, isn't it? And as she says in her article, no, it's nothing like a broken leg. And now, sometimes it's a kind of this performative empathy and sort of showy, I care more than you do, sort of patronising attitude. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I realise, you know, I'm not suggesting, I'm not being cynical. There's a lot of very compassionate people. I'm not suggesting that people are motivated by, you know, they're being deliberately negative or malevolent about these things. But one thing you'll see on social media is these, as I call them, these memes or posts: share if you care. If you don't, if you won't, you don't. You know, you obviously don't care. and it's almost there's a lot of noise on the surface about attention to mental health difficulties. But as I say, what it's doing is eliding the distinction between mental illness and ordinary psychological difficulties, and also perhaps, you know, a lot of the things I work with, very real emotional and psychological difficulties that do lend themselves to input from a psychotherapist like myself. But I think it's backfiring in so many ways, because what it means is it's evading the input that's so urgently needed for people with serious mental illness by putting the whole nation on the couch. So it's that kind of shift from state and citizen to the therapeutic state and the patient. You know, you're someone who is probably vulnerable, and you don't recognise how vulnerable you are. Ken McLaughlin, former mental health social worker and lecturer in social work at Manchester Metropolitan University, was saying this thing about vulnerables has become like a noun. You know, there is a community of vulnerables who are, you know, waiting to be micromanaged by the state. And I think that a lot of very well-meaning people around mental health awareness campaigning will promote and increase awareness, but it doesn't seem to be making that much of a difference, other than making people feel better about themselves, saying how much they care about mental health.
What would you say to somebody who says there's a problem with the distinction between real mental illness and everyday emotions that make you suffer, that really we haven't been compassionate enough about the everyday emotions that make people suffer? That the whole distinction between the serious mental health condition versus ordinary life, which causes you to suffer, that distinction comes out of a callous perspective, which doesn't really see people as being as vulnerable as they really are. Because that's what a lot of people at the moment are saying.
Okay, and I suppose that lends itself to the idea of kind of the continuum, you know, which is obviously is something that's used routinely in my profession. There's a continuum in mental health. It's quantitative rather than qualitative. Mm-hmm. That unless you keep people's well-being in check all the time, then you're actually not paying attention to the risk of the very causes that might lead people to develop serious mental health problems later in life. Yes. The problem I have with that, again, it's the don't think of the colour red thing. You know, I don't think, and this is one of the striking things, a lot of people, mental health campaigners, might agree with a lot of what I say, but they still prioritise mental health awareness and will disagree on other things. They'll agree and they'll say, yeah, I know what you mean. It's really depressing to know that 4 and 5-year-olds are talking about having eating disorders. And it is depressing, isn't it? There aren't many people who would be delighted to hear that, but it is happening. You know, very young children speak mental health. Maybe some people would argue, well, that's really good because it means they're articulate in this very serious problem, and it means that they'll be well prepared in protecting their mental health as they get older. I mean, I couldn't disagree more with that kind of diagnosis creep. I mean, I've got a statistic here. I mean, this is from March. This is US. Back in March 2002, 575,000 children diagnosed with anxiety disorders, 136,000 of them under the age of 10. Mm-hmm. And another citation here from Dr. Jennifer Cunningham, a community paediatrician from Glasgow, who's saying mental health is defined so widely that any child who has a normal reaction to adverse circumstances in their life is now assumed to have mental health problems. Now, obviously, she's concerned about that. So that's what I would challenge, is that being aware about mental health, that phrase in itself, obviously a good thing. I mean, I'm a mental health professional. I wouldn't want people not to be aware about mental health. It's a very important and serious issue. But, you know, that's the thing, is paradoxically, I don't think it's good for people's mental health to see the colour red all the time and to interpret those difficulties. I think it stores up problems for the future rather than, it has the opposite effect. It's like, be careful what you wish for. I think it potentially has the opposite effect, where you say if you make people aware of these things all the time, it actually cultivates their vulnerability rather than their resilience, which in the long term is less likely to be good for their mental health. So my starting point might be the same as theirs, and say, well, of course I'm concerned about mental health. That's that's what I dedicate myself to. That's the job that I love, and it's important to me. But my concern is that if you medicalize all these experiences on the basis that we need to be sensitive to a whole range of vulnerabilities, which of course we do in many respects. We're a lot more alert to the kind of difficulties that human beings face than we've done in the past. We've come a long way. But if that becomes the starting point for things, I think it's really self-defeating, and I think you see it in education. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that education has been transformed into a kind of well-being and self-esteem project. Whereas I would argue that what's really good for your self-esteem is to find yourself uncomfortable and find things difficult and find things challenging. I mean, it's entered the language, hasn't it? I'm sorry, I found this a bit challenging. I found this a bit difficult. And I think a lot of clients are, for example, young students, university students that I work with who are full of all kinds of anxieties, and they're of that generation of safe spaces.
The snowflakes.
And also, yeah, so-called. But they've also had it drilled into them that if they don't do the right degree, they'll fail. That whole thing about studying for the sake of studying. There are obviously so many other factors, and I do tend to find that a lot of the time when I'm working with clients, I'll recommend books that are not therapy books. I'll recommend critical essays or sociological or political books or other books because they're inundated with self-help books. Do you know what I mean? And I just think it increases their anxieties. Because they're constant, people are bombarded with these threats and risks all the time. How could you not internalize these things? And maybe I've got this, maybe I've got that. So kind of almost like hypochondria becomes a natural state.
I was just thinking about how the culture of this happened. Do you think that there's a generation of people who, say, had a life experience where as teenagers or in their 20s, they did a lot of really extreme, bizarre, sexually promiscuous or drug-taking, self-destructive behavior. They got a diagnosis in their 30s or afterwards. And then they thought, well, if I had known about these symptoms, if I had known about my problems when I was a kid, this might have never happened to me. And that's why there's such a push to bring awareness to children.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. So you're kind of saying, obviously I work with a lot of clients who may have done a lot of self-medicating with, drugs, heavy or not so heavy, and they recognised that they were kind of trying to suppress certain kinds of difficulties, or whether it be severely traumatic experiences or other difficulties in between. And yeah, I think it's quite reasonable that they might say, I wish I'd known more about, I wish I'd had more insight into psychology and mental health when I was younger. But I suppose, we can all regret things, can't we? There's the benefit of hindsight. And obviously things, again, I wouldn't want to minimise there is a lot of real progress that's been made over the last 20 or 30 years. And service user involvement with mental health services, which has got a long way to go, but this is a really positive thing. But, I might work with people in their 20s, 30s, right up to their 70s who are convinced that their life's over and it's been wrecked because of drug use and a whole range of regrets. But I still think it's beneficial to work with them because they can come to understand and gain some insights and bring in a better kind of acceptance and a lot of the time, where I live and work, it's a very poor part of South Staffordshire. It's a different world than the world people associate with, Manhattan psychotherapy. That counts for a lot. Do you know what I mean? It's a different world, and people have different needs. And a lot of the time, you meet people who basically they regret the fact that they didn't get out. They didn't get out of town, and they didn't. There's obviously a huge number of things that come from outside the room, but we can only do so much. Psychotherapists can't claim to have all the answers to understanding how to deal with regret and human distress. And
well, here's a kind of a more controversial question. Do you think there's something valuable about people not getting help when they're struggling?
It's quite difficult because because it's kind of abstract, isn't it, and concrete. Again, in some cases yes, in others not. I've certainly met. Like I said, I find it quite inspiring. Every now and then, I'll meet a client who's in their 20s, who obviously knows the language of mental health, and they're delighted that I agree with them about some of attitudes towards mental health today. They take they've kind of given me permission to say some of these things, so they'll turn around and say, I'm sick and tired of mental health awareness because all my friends do is go on social media about how much they care, and yet they never stay in touch with me. Mm-hmm. My mental illness is not fashionable enough, and it's good for them to vent about those things. And they may come in and say, other people might come in and say, I hate you, you're like all the rest, you're coppers, social workers, you're all the rest, or you're going to section me, you're going to lock me up, and obviously you need to persuade them otherwise. So yes, and some people might say to me, again, the evidence would come from the client themselves. Mm-hmm. So someone might say, I was left alone and it's what I needed. It did me good. Others, definitely not, obviously, So I feel like I can't answer the question, but clients do answer that question sometimes. Right. But in the broader sense of that kind of facing difficulty, and obviously it's very, very important in therapy, not least in cognitive therapy, that I spend every day telling people you've got to keep doing things you don't want to do. Mm-hmm. You've got to keep walking into the storm and walking over the hot coals again. I made a real breakthrough with a client again recently the day, and obviously there's a whole range of, in our service, there's a lot of emphasis on the relationship between physical and mental health problems. People have long-term chronic health conditions. Other people have hypochondriasis, which, as I say, is called health anxiety these days because of hypochondria is associated with being a derogatory term, mm-hmm. which I think is silly, because I think it's actually really good to talk to a client and say, how do you feel about the fact that people call you a hypochondriac? Mm-hmm. That's a good thing to explore, because obviously hypochondriasis is actually a really serious and distressing condition.
Yeah, it's like, how do you feel if people call you fat?
Exactly. Instead of sugarcoating it, let's get right down to the nitty-gritty. And it's really striking, actually. It makes me smile with clients. One of the things that clients most apologise for is they say, I just want to be normal. And then they go, oh, sorry, I'm not supposed to say that word, am I? So they've internalized and they apologize to the therapist because they assume the therapist is going to be the most PC person they've ever met. And they say, I'm not supposed to say that, am I? And I'll always say, look, you're supposed to say whatever you want. This is completely free speech in here. Do not censor yourself. And I have no problem with the idea of normal. And it can generate, obviously, some interesting discussions that are key to building a relationship with the client. So yeah, everyone minds their P's and Q's in that respect. So I've kind of drifted on. Oh, you're saying is it sometimes on principle the right thing to do to leave people to their own devices? Basically, is what you said, wasn't it?
Or would it be good as a way
of
would it be good as a way of containing all of the numbers of people who want to go into therapy to sort of encourage the culture, sort yourself out?
Yeah, again, it's a tough one because, like I said, the vast majority of clients who come to my service and who I assess, I do work with them. So it almost seems like I'm being a hypocrite. Think, well, I got the impression, Jim, that you'd be turning everyone away, but of course, in reality, people's symptoms are real. Mm-hmm. The fact, that I don't think it's like a black and white thing. I do think you could make a case that, a kind of 21st century neuroses and anxieties do have particular quality. It's not just that you turn around, you've got nothing to worry about, stop worrying, because it's real. The symptoms people experience are very, very real, and you need to work with it. So it's not that people aren't struggling. It's just an explanation and where we go next, and whatever step we take in terms of this professional, politically or culturally. Those are where the difficult questions lie. Is that how did we get here? How did we get to a point where? Like, how did we get here, and where do we go from here? Which is obviously big questions. You know, I do not spend most of my time at working. Oh, here's another person who doesn't need to come here. That, on the contrary, people come because they are really struggling, and you know, the broader question of how we got here, of how the human race survived for so long without there being a psychological therapy services in every sort of major town is it's a bigger question. but yeah, but the problems are real. What doesn't help, I don't think, is the broader. It's a kind of pressure to conform to that. Professor Frank Furedi, you know, wrote Therapy Culture, cultivating vulnerability in an uncertain age. You know, and that's a book that upset a lot of people in my profession. I saw these reviews and I wondered if they read the same book. They started with the same conclusion and looked for evidence to fit it. That's what I saw as kind of cognitive dissonance. This guy wants to go back to the good old days, which is, you know, I don't think that's true at all.
Could you tell our audience?
Rather than being an enlightenment discovery that we're more in touch with our emotions, for example, emotional intelligence, which is just fraudulent kind of marketing term. Emotional maturity, I think, is something else. It's doing more harm than good in the long run. But yeah, there are some really difficult questions to ask about where we go next with this. I mean, I'm working in this field, and I'm skeptical about the foundation of the kind of services that I'm working for. But it doesn't mean you can't do really, really good work within them. Right. And by and large, the people who come really do need help in one way or another, even if it's not necessarily quote-unquote classic psychotherapy.
Could you, just for a minute, tell our listeners what therapy culture is?
Okay. I think therapism is a useful term. I think some people might be familiar with some of the texts sort of around this, like, as I mentioned, Frank Furedi's Therapy Culture, One Nation Under Therapy, Sattel and Hoff-Summers, Therapeutic State, Nolan. I think they captured that shifting relationship between a state and citizen, and you know, I think one of the things that you said to me was about where does this fit in relation to social control. And I think that a good way to understand this is that obviously in my profession, especially in person-centered counselling, non-judgmentalism, that's an everyday phrase, which is kind of key in a therapy room, but it's singularly ill-suited to politics. And famously, Bill Clinton, I think, was it 92? He said, "I feel your pain."
Yeah. he had a hand gesture to go with that as well.
He definitely said it. I've seen the clip. I think it was a conference where, I think it was an AIDS conference, and an activist heckled him, and he said, "I feel the pain." And that moment itself might not have been that important, but it kind of became totemic of that shift to sort of therapeutic politics. One way of thinking of it is I kind of think the contemporary political imagination is estranged from making value judgments. You know, so if you think of that kind of, you know, it's that kind of Emperor's New Clothes, the exhaustion of political traditions as we came towards the end of the 20th century. And I think from that you get a kind of non-committal relativism, which people, thinking critics left and right, are concerned about. And I think that lent itself to a therapeutic turn in politics. You know, it's kind of micromanaging people's lives. People, there's a lot of talk about empowerment, and again, I mentioned Ken McLaughlin earlier, who's written really well about this, about how what it disguises is a kind of submitting yourself to the state to be micromanaged, conforming to certain kind of Obviously, there's politics of behaviour and nudge, and all these things are related to that. So I think it's related to a shrinking of a political realm, a shrinking of a political culture that has lent itself to the therapeutic option. It's kind of become an act of desperation in some ways. What else do we believe in? You know, I mean, people used to joke in the 90s about what do people believe in? So, well, they believe in sport, the NHS, and that the Nazis were really bad. And that's about the only thing they could agree on. You know, obviously that's kind of a comic caricature of it. But that therapeutic turn, I think, has got a lot to do with that. It's kind of, you know, and obviously I think, from my point of view, I'm politically minded, but I think politics should be definitely not in the therapy room, and therapy shouldn't be in politics. But that's not the case, is it now? They're so intertwined.
There's at least two ways that therapy at the moment is intertwining with politics, and that is people who want certain etiquette which reflects their understanding of society, or people who feel slighted by society because they're in a marginalized group. They often use mental health language to try and justify people not saying certain things to them or not having them read certain books.
It's a very good point. I think it's a very important branch of identity politics, isn't it? That's just what I was thinking earlier. Do you think? I don't know if you agree with that. It's very much related to that.
Well, I mean, it certainly seems like the identitarians are using therapy as an excuse to sort of say that their oppression should be considered a form of public knowledge, rather than just a particular form of activism that you may disagree with.
Absolutely. So it's that kind of affirmation thing, you know. And the flip side of that is this performative empathy and narcissism. Mm-hmm. Show me how much you care. If you don't care about me as much as I demand that you do, you're obviously the enemy. And then other people boasting. And again, they don't think of it as boasting. They're just showing how compassionate they are. And it's an empty ersatz empathy. And yeah, I think it is very much tied to that. So, I mean, Frank Furedi and others have talked about how you're talking about the recasting of personhood in terms of vulnerability. Mm-hmm. And that's, making the point against those who would suggest otherwise, that's the danger, is that, the law of unintended consequences. Whatever your intentions are, be careful what you wish for becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you start telling this extremely dubious slogan, which is of course all over the walls in most of these therapy services, 1 in 4 people are mentally ill, 1 in 4 people experience sexual abuse, 1 in 4 people are this, and the criteria they use for this is extremely dishonest. It may be motivated by some people by very well-meaning motives to draw attention to people who are struggling or people who are excluded from public life, but it ends up extending the idea of people being weak and vulnerable, which is actually quite a betrayal of the kind of radical tradition that some of these people might lay claim to. If you think about the women's liberation or feminist mm-hmm. traditions, where they were resisting the medicalisation of women's oppression, whereas now you're more likely to see, you don't realise how many mental health problems I've got, you don't realise how much I'm suffering. And I think a lot of people, whatever their political persuasion, would be quite concerned that that's a very fragile basis for autonomy and empowerment and progress.
This is interesting because a lot of people seem to like that vulnerability because they get something in exchange for it, which is accommodation. So, I mean, to give you an example, in my own case, I'm going through a diagnosis right now where it's highly probable that I will come out at the end of it with an official Asperger's diagnosis.
Oh,
but
okay.
So, on the one hand, I'm accepting this label which announces to people that I'm vulnerable, which you might think is not so pleasant. But on the other hand, what I get in exchange for that label is not having to do things everybody else has to do or is expected to do. And I'm getting some special privileges and accommodation that come with my being seen as vulnerable.
And that's something for you to negotiate, isn't it? That's the thing, is I trust you to be able to negotiate that, however you see fit,
Yeah, but I mean, I can understand the appeal of vulnerability because it's not just vulnerability, it's privileges.
Absolutely, it's inescapable. I mean, I'm thinking back to when I was doing my doctoral thesis, when I was really struggling a great deal with anxiety to the point where I was barely leaving my house, and it really stalled. Well, it stopped academic career, and kind of was the making of me being a mental health professional in one way or another. And you know, that kind of the victimology, you know, the language of victimology was there, and people who were fellow travellers with sort of left-wing thinkers at the time would, you know, would say, play the victim.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it works. You know, you're getting state benefits. You want to do this, you want to do that. Play the victim card. And in other situations, you know, you're kind of being pragmatic about it. Hopefully, not becoming a way of life, being an opportunist. So, but yeah, it's a good point. It's a really good point. It's also made me think something else I was saying about how it's striking how clients well into their 30s and beyond, as I say, that phrase, you speak mental health. They know the language of mental health. It's part of everyday vocabulary. Mm-hmm. It's here to stay. So I've got a few clients who are suffering from very severe cases of OCD, and we have a very, very good chat about how we both really can't stand the fact that everyone says they're a bit OCD. That's therapeutic for them. Do you know what I mean? Have a good vent about the fact that people say that we're probably bipolar. What's interesting is that what I do find is that clients with more serious problems, or those who haven't stuck to a script written for them by this kind of culture of victimhood and low expectations, are the ones who are more likely to make progress because they don't see a payoff that others do in a victim identity.
Mm-hmm.
Is what I mean? It's like it's waiting for them. And that's not a condemnation of people. It's inescapable, isn't it? We're all, to use that word, vulnerable to these things. You know, we're not living on an island. We're all susceptible to things. I know I certainly have been in the past. I mean, I really was ambivalent about being diagnosed with agoraphobia, generalized anxiety disorder, all these disorders. You know, at first it was like, oh, I've got a disorder. Mm-hmm. You know, it's a bit like that old advert on British TV where the mother says, oh, you've got an ology. That's good. That's got to be good. You know what I mean? It's almost like it's validating in some way, and I can use that. But it also worked against me because it undermined my capacity to go, hang on a minute. These disorders were invented in the early 80s. Surely I'm not the first person to have been, what's the agoraphobia translates as fear of the marketplace. No, it's an old thing, you know, and that creative impulse we have, and one of the things I'm particularly getting interested in obsessive compulsive disorder and working with those clients, and as is always the case, as with clients who, that's a whole other debate, addiction. You meet clients who were addicted to heroin, or they had this, you find out what happened. They fell in love, they got a good job, they left the area, they turned their life around. Clients with OCD who've got very creative, productive lives can really start to beat a path between what's called, I don't know if you're familiar with the term, thought action fusion OCD, where you become preoccupied with the idea that thinking something is the same as doing it. And it's that creative potential and going out of their comfort zone and testing themselves. And that's really an interesting example where someone has got a serious mental health problem, but that's no reason to treat them with kid gloves. And you're actually saying you've got fantastic potential as a person. Let's really work on building that resilience. We recognise you've got really difficult problems here. You've got a genuine mental health problem here that most people don't understand how devastatingly distressing it can be. But there's this creative side of you which is not emphasized as much in these debates, because there is this emphasis on being a victim, being passive in the face of a diagnosis creep. I mean, as we well know, the DSM, which I'm sure people are familiar with, them, Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger.
Well, it makes it sound, you know, it makes it sound like the amount of people in the world who don't have mental health problems are extremely small and extremely boring.
That's it, you know. That's it, you know. I mean, otherwise very bright people. I mean, I got into some big arguments colleagues about this. Lend me an article saying everyone's OCD or everyone's autistic. I'm thinking, how can something be a disorder if it's the order of things? You know, it doesn't make any sense. Or someone I know who's a very experienced medical professional who said, I think everyone's got a disorder. And I'm thinking that the statement makes no sense. It's like Alice in Wonderland. If that's the case, then that's order.
Yeah.
You know, it's a completely illogical statement. And then people will talk about continuums, and I do recommend this article to people that was in the garden by the journalist I mentioned, and it's also quite funny and witty, but you can see how angry and upset she gets when she comes back and she sees a tweet that says, oh, if you've got a mental health problem, don't worry, it's just like measles, it's normal, isn't it? Now that might come from a well-meaning, if naive and rather tactless position, but she's understanding, saying, no, it's not. Having schizophrenia or bipolar disorder is not like having measles. It's not even comparable. And so this well-meaning thing of normalizing things actually does more harm than good, because it means you have, as she puts it, palatable, fashionable mental health conditions. I use the word fashionable, not her, not to put words in her mouth. And you have the attention just gets, it's inconsistent, it's confused, it's contradictory. Ordinary suffering gets pathologized. Extraordinary mental illnesses get described as normal. You get mental health campaigners who are basically offering on a plate to the government this message, yeah, you're right, actually, we don't need to fund things too much, because basically the problem is public perception and interpretation, mental health awareness. What we need is more of that, and then things will be better. And it's kind of like the emperor's new clothes, I think, in some ways.
What do you think of the phrase breaking the stigma?
First of all, there, as I said earlier, you know, there is stigma, you know, attached to certain mental health conditions. Erica Crompton, who's a journalist and mental health campaigner who invited me to contribute to her article recently about mental health in cinema, she's got schizophrenia, paranoid schizophrenia. That's a serious mental illness, and she's just talked about it a lot. She's Staffordshire-based journalist who's worked all over the world, written for the New York Times, fashion business, and she's written a lot. And you know, and I don't want to speak for Erica. I imagine we disagree on a lot of things because she's very much involved in mental health awareness. But to me, she's at the top end of stuff because she's talking about serious mental illness. Do you know what I mean? Almost, again, I don't want to trivialise the difficulties that other people have that I've had myself. I mean, I've never had a serious mental illness, but I have. My life was basically turned upside down with agoraphobia. I mean, it's disabling, but it's in a different league. It really is in a different league. So when the anti-stigma campaigns come along, and again, they focus on this general view of mental health, of well-being, of, you know, it's a kind of palatable view of things, but the really distressing, painful side of it is not addressed. And this is what's striking, is that I'll see clients, again, they might be in their 20s, 30s, right into the 50s and 60s, not surprisingly older clients, and they say, oh, you know, I'm a bit concerned about coming here because of the stigma, mental illness. Obviously, I hear that all the time. And I'll say, well, surely there isn't a stigma of mental illness these days. I mean, look at us. We're in the middle of the town centre in a poor part of South Staffordshire. There's no way a service like this would have existed in the past. Mental health is absolutely everywhere. Think of it's in the public realm. Can you name a day or a week where mental health is not mentioned in public life? Barely a week goes by without mental health awareness. I bet you could name 10 celebrities who struggle with mental health problems. And of course, always people say, oh, that's the point. And they've internalized that script about that because it's part of the mental health awareness thing. Strikingly, when I work with clients who really have, they may be have struggled with severe mental illness or psychosis or a range of other problems, they really have been stigmatized.
Do you think that there are some things where actually stigma is good? So, for instance, if somebody with a mental health condition behaves in a way where this person frightens people and this person makes people not want to hire them at job interviews, is that something for which we should break the stigma, or is that stigma a good thing? Because mental health often produces frightening behavior.
It's a good question, and again, as the journalist I mentioned had written this article, she said it's no picnic. Hannah Jane Bogginson. Severe mental illness can really impact negatively on other people, but and you can behave very, very badly. And there we are. I've made a judgment as what's behaving unacceptably or badly, or in a way that's taboo, or, as you say, maybe a stigma should still be attached to it. And this is one of the myths of non-judgmentalism in the therapy room. When I argue with people who are from that tradition, I say, you make judgments all the time. You wouldn't be able to complete a conversation with another human being if you didn't make judgments. Mm-hmm. It's just this mythical thing. You make judgments constantly, or else you'd just be gibbering. And I'm no doubt many times a client will be saying to me, you'll never guess what happened, this happened, that happened. Because they're quite realistically expecting me to go, that's awful, that's shocking, or about other people's behaviour, maybe people who've offended or upset or abused them in some way or impacted on their mental health. Or it might be a client saying to me, Jim, you never guess what I did the other day. I did something really terrible, behaved in a way that's totally unacceptable, the kind of behaviour that would be, he might not use the word stigma, but it would be stigmatised behaviour of some kind. And instead of being soft-soaping it, I think serious mental illness can and not so serious mental illness can lead to people behaving in ways that there's a reason that we have social conventions. There are things you don't do, as people say.
Yeah, I mean, for instance, I suffer from depression. And I remember a few years ago, it was news that some pilot who had depression went mad and he flew a plane into the ground.
Oh, yeah.
And then there was a kind of an anti-stigma campaign, don't use depression in reference to this guy. Don't say he was crazy because he had depression. There was all these words that you were supposed to use about it or not use about it.
It's a good example.
As a way of not stigmatizing people. And I would say happily, as somebody who suffers from depression, as unpleasant as it is to be associated with somebody who could potentially fly off the handle and fly a plane into the ground, and I would never do that, I don't see people being leery of that because of my diagnosis as a problem with society. That seems like it's understandable that they would.
Which is a reminder that depression isn't a broken leg, is it? It's a completely unique experience for every individual. Just as someone, a dear friend of mine a few years ago would be arguing with another friend when he's on an acute ward about the rights and wrongs of suicide, which obviously is another huge thing to discuss. And it's not as if the depressed are a community who unite in their opinions. Mm-hmm. It's a factor. It's may or may not, in some circumstances, be a useful diagnosis to a point. Sometimes it's not that useful. It depends, obviously, how you understand it and the different approaches to treating it. But obviously, the experience of it is really, really unique. Whereas having a broken leg is fairly similar for most human beings. So obviously, your moral compass and your expectations of yourself and your judgments about how another person who's depressed might behave, you may be just as likely as anyone else to go, what a truly terrible thing that person did. You may be just as likely as anyone else to go, I would never do that, what a terrible thing, or otherwise. Again, the range of interpretations are as rich and as complex as anybody else's interpretations.
It makes you wonder about the extent to which mental health, on the one hand, kind of gives you this face of non-judgmentalism as an exterior, because in terms of what a clinician does, they're making judgments all the time about people morally. Sometimes maybe even judgments that go farther than what is warranted. Yep. Like I often have a worry that, if you put somebody who may or may not be a psychopath with different clinicians, some clinicians may diagnose them as one, other clinicians may not. And diagnosing somebody with a label like psychopath is an extremely moralistic judgment. It's basically saying that no one should get in a relationship with you. You know, it's saying ipso facto that if somebody loves you, they shouldn't.
That's a really good point, I think. That's really quite profound, I think, isn't it? Because
I wrote a book about this, by the way. I have
encountered what I would call psychopathic behaviour, but as you say, you can't pretend that there isn't a moral judgment involved in that sense. And you're saying that this person is beyond the pale, and it's true that a lot of the medical language we use is what, I mean, people don't talk about the lunatics or the madmen or the evil people, do they? There's this kind of antiquated language, and you know, that is the kind of psychiatric language that is used, and it still has a moral content to it, doesn't it? Even though it's contained in this strict boundaries of diagnosis.
I mean, you can, in a way, almost think of like modern rebels today would be people who would say, yeah, my therapist told me my girlfriend was a psychopath, but I'm going to rebel and love her anyway.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, that's making me think of, is it Foucault, Madness and Civilization, that thing about, you know, the French revolutionaries came characterised as iconic of madness or lunacy. So yeah, there's a very rich history to all this as well, isn't it? But yeah, that's really quite thought-provoking what you said, I think, about psychopathy and all these other various, and perhaps more commonly, my line of work is personality disorder. It's kind of a generic term, so you'll encounter people who've been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, emotionally unstable personality disorder, a whole range of them, and new ones coming out every week, you know, as they are with this. Psychopath or sociopath might be kind of further down the scale. But, you know, those are obviously hotly debated, you know, because people will say, well, basically they're labels given to people who don't fit in, they don't conform to our moral expectations, they don't behave correctly, they're not necessarily dangerous, just as psychopaths might not be dangerous, of course, because obviously the myth of they mean physically or violently dangerous. That it's just a cover story for not being able to explain it, just as, you know, one of the things that happens a lot, especially in the last 10 years in psychotherapy, of course, is this overlap with, well, I call it the syndrome. There are lots of syndromes these days. You know, so you encounter a lot of people who are diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome.
Right.
They don't have any explanation. I mean, okay, a lot of medical experts say, well, most illnesses don't have any, which we don't know why people get ill, and we don't know why they get better, which is true. But that becomes an important part of what we do, because, of course, people are more likely to see these. They're looking for a medical explanation when, in fact, it may well have more of a psychological, existential explanation. And it becomes kind of complex. I remember, again, I mentioned Dr. Michael Fitzpatrick, and I remember him talking about, and again, this reminds me of how I work with some of my clients. We might not agree, we might not be speaking the same language about what they've got. Jim, I've got IBS, I've got this, I've got OCD, and all this, but we might not agree. But we still work well together, because I'm working with the symptoms, and I'm working with exploring it in a different way. And I remember him saying he had a patient who had been diagnosed, I think, possibly with chronic fatigue syndrome, and they disagreed quite strongly about what that meant, you know, and she's like, you don't think it exists, you know. They'd fall out, but she kept coming back to him because he's a good doctor and works well with the symptoms. You know, that's something that I see quite often, you know, and I like the fact that I can have a good disagreement with clients, that we feel free to be able to really challenge each other, but then still know that they're going to come back because they know I'm not going to sprinkle any sugar on things. I'm there for them, and I'm dedicated to working with them and building a therapeutic relationship, but I'm not going to just pretend that I agree with everything that they say. People appreciate that. They want to be treated like adults, not children.
And speaking of that kind of treating people as adults rather than children, not kind of emphasizing vulnerability and all the rest of it, I was curious if you've noticed the existence of a kind of backlash to therapy culture in the form of anti-therapy culture.
Not really. Have you?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because it's kind of it's intertwined with a lot of politics at the moment, which are very much against kind of vulnerability and what's called progressivism. But for instance, I was thinking if you read a lot of Spiked magazine and you listen to what Brendan O'Neill says and so on, there are a lot of repeated comments about how the virtuous person is the tough person, the person who doesn't need any help. And sort of the sickening person, the embarrassing person, the weak person is the person who goes to therapy and parades around their vulnerability. So there's almost like a kind of association of virtue with a sort of like masculine independence and not needing other people to help you. And you can see that all over different forms of the political right at the moment, whether it's like men's rights activism, whether it's Trump. It's almost like there's a return of the masculine as a rebellion against the oversaturation of the culture with vulnerability fixation. What do you think about this?
That's interesting because it was almost like I was surprised by myself because obviously most of the names I've mentioned are people who write for, have been associated with Spiked Online, and I think it's one of the best publications among others in terms of critical thinking about the things that we've been talking about. So it may seem a bit odd that when I said no, I haven't noticed that. I suppose I was kind of expecting you to refer to something like almost like a social or political movement or something where it was making itself known, particularly when in fact that therapeutic culture is still very, very dominant. But in terms of criticism, and challenging that, then a big yes, and I welcome it very much.
Mm-hmm.
But I wouldn't see it in the way that you just described it, which I think was a caricature.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't. I think that there's some truth in that, and it's provocative sometimes. Like a defense of masculinity as a provocation to its demonization and sort of what you might call victim feminism or identitarian feminism. I think that's most welcome. But I wouldn't. That's not how I've read Spiked as being like the strong and the vulnerable and nothing much in between. That's not what I see when I read it. I mean, obviously I mentioned Ken McLaughlin.
Yeah. Well, I should say that
if you read their work, they certainly don't come across to me like that. But
I should say that I'm a huge fan of Spiked, so that's not a criticism of Spiked, and I'm interested in what you described as a caricature. Maybe it is an unjust caricature or a bad interpretation of what it is that they're doing. But
I thought it was a provocation. I thought you were kind of like throwing, you were testing me, which is good. I thought you were kind of testing me to see how I respond in that respect. So but I wouldn't caricaturize it in that way. But I do think when I've recommended to colleagues in my profession who I've said, introduced, and I've introduced discussions or debates at work, and 2 or 3 people have been interested in questioning some of these. Some of the kind of tropes and dogmas of their profession, it's often Spiked articles I've recommended they read, and that they really engage with and enjoyed it. It hasn't particularly outraged them, But I still think that there's therapy and there's therapy,
Yeah.
It depends what part of the world you are and what your background is and what kind of service you work in. But I tend to recommend the mental health section of Spiked very widely to people.
Oh, so do I. But what I suppose I see it as being a bit broader than Spiked, because I see this same thing in America in Canadian men's rights activism. I see it to some extent in the dark web, which isn't really directly affiliated with Spiked. It just seems like generally there is a rebellion against the vulnerability culture, which is kind of positing virtue in terms of self-reliance, masculinity, the ability to take risks.
Would you say that was something you'd associate with, like, what would be called the alt-right?
It ranges from everything...
because that's what it sounds more like.
I think that the alt-right and the middle and the left, it's very difficult to differentiate those parts of the political spectrum. But it does seem like there is a spectrum of beliefs outside of the mainstream that are very anti-vulnerability. And whether you're dealing with the left-hand spectrum or the right-hand spectrum, what they all have in common is they make statements that suggest that we need to return to self-reliance and masculinity. And I would say Spikes make those kind of statements. At least that suggests that to me.
I suppose you could say it was in the same very broad ballpark, I suppose. I know what you mean, and I do think perhaps there's a parallel there in terms of, we live in interesting times where we need a new vocabulary, don't we, to capture a new, we need to establish some kind of political outlook that can't be easily slotted into left-right traditions. I mean, that's obviously a whole other discussion, but that does relate to that, doesn't it? Like you said about obviously political correctness, which is so widely misunderstood. I mean, I consider myself very much from a radical left tradition, although I don't tend to call myself that now because I don't tend to find I agree with anyone I meet who calls himself left, but obviously that's a whole other thing, and which is probably why I'm more drawn towards Spike for that reason.
I love Spike
political
for similar
correctness
reasons.
is very, obviously, unsurprisingly, in a therapy and therapism and therapists, it's full of all kinds of etiquette, of state-sponsored etiquette about what you can and can't say, which, again, I think would fit into that doing more harm than good, because it underestimates the very people who want to turn their lives around. So, yeah, I mean, almost everything we've touched on could turn into a major discussion itself, couldn't it?
Well, what's interesting is if you think back to how we got to where we are, it seems a lot of this kind of preoccupation with breaking stigmas and vulnerability that comes from the 60s, right?
Yeah.
So if you think of we're in our own kind of cultural war, which is paralleling that, where instead of fighting for vulnerability, people are fighting for masculinity, you could say, well, that's an interesting thing to speculate about regarding how it's going to influence future decades of therapy.
Indeed. I mean, I would love to have a crystal ball because it would be interesting to see, when these IAP services, NHS IAP services were rolled out, I was as critical of some of the foundation of these things, which I don't know if you know much about it. Lord Layard, the economist, who's kind of being counter, found himself part of a government project to sort of getting people back to work with a dose of CBT.
Yeah.
Anyone would be sceptical of these things, although I'm very much a defender of CBT, and I think it's misrepresented. And like a lot of good ideas, they get their light versions, CBT light, and they become these kind of government issue programs that actually undermine the often very rich psychotherapeutic traditions that they have. That's the twofold skepticism that I would, I like to call myself the skeptical therapist, is that first of all, I think regardless of whether you're a therapist, whatever endeavour human endeavour you're in, skepticism is healthy, as distinct from cynicism, is questioning what you do and testing your ideas against other people's and not getting stuck in routine and dogma. It's just not good for what you're committing yourself to. The other aspect of it is I suppose one of the things we've been talking about, which is therapism and the therapy culture. And I would defend psychotherapy against it being contaminated by therapy culture just as much as I defend the need to develop a new politics that is not full of therapism.
So suppose we go into the future, let's say to like 2000, 2018 now? Suppose we go to 2068, and suppose we find ourselves in a Western society where very few people go to therapy because they want to be self-reliant, and if they have problems, they would rather suffer in silence rather than talk about them, and that's the way society goes.
But it seems like a false opposition that the only alternative, that it's just a seesaw thing, that, it seems to me that you're saying the choice is between dependence and self-reliance. That's the thing that jars with me, because I would take the position that it's precisely because I want to see a robust sense of self and agency, and that depends on connections with others. It depends on You know, you can't have a robust sense of self without a robust sense of the collective, which is a whole other philosophical, political decision. But I don't recognise that, you know, that's out the way and we're all self-reliant. It depends what you mean by self-reliance, I suppose.
Okay, so suppose these 2,068 people, the reason they don't like therapy is political. They think that there's something politically dubious about telling other people your problems and allowing those people to give you strategies to self-improve, rather than those strategies coming from yourself, because they're worried that therapists want to control them. And that's why they're so self-reliant. Would you think there's something wrong with that?
Well, if that was the circumstance, I mean, it sounds like a dystopian sort of thing, doesn't it? It's like Orwellian. If that was a situation, I think that was entirely positive. If people thought that someone like me was in the role of trying to control, determining and advising them how they should live their life according to certain edicts, then they would be quite rightly to tell me to jump off the nearest cliff.